Hello, and welcome to another episode of my Type 35 build. Today is a glorious spring day. Though I'm not talking about the weather outside, I'm talking about the progress that's been made inside, because the car is now supported by its own suspension on all four corners, which is pretty cool. The front end is a pretty basic setup. It uses a Hotchkiss style suspension, so leaf springs located parallel to each other on both sides of the car, which serve to locate the axle and support the vehicle. It's clean looking, effective, and the best part, it works really smoothly. The springs themselves are located with a fixed spring eye on the leading end of the springs, held into place by a 5/8 shoulder bolt that fastens into the front spring crossmember end bell, which allows the bolt to be tightened down while the spring is able to rotate freely during suspension movement. The trailing end of the spring is held in place with a sliding shackle and hanger assembly. The hanger is bolted to the chassis on the sides and bottom, similar to an original Type 35, and has a 5/8 shoulder bolt, similar to the front hanger, welded through it, allowing the nut on the end to tighten down and the shackle to rotate freely. The shackle itself is pretty cool. I built it to rotate around the hanger pin and allow the leaves to slide in and out as the suspension moves. There's even a couple of anti-friction pads in there to keep everything nice and quiet. If you're thinking the shackles look a little familiar, there's a reason. I originally intended them to attach to the front cross member with the spring above the shackle bolt and the fixed end attached to the rear hanger bracket, exactly like a Type 59 had. But when I got it all bolted together, it just wasn't as pleasing to the eye as I'd expected. So I reversed the springs, flipped the shackle upside down, and serendipitously, it looked a whole lot better. The rear shackle isn't the same shape as an original Type 35, but it's much cleaner looking than a swinging shackle like most leaf springs have. The springs themselves are held to the axle with U-bolts and a flat spring plate, which is a little pedestrian. There are cooler ways to mount them, but there's more in store for those plates, so they won't always be so hokey looking. But for now, I did take the time to weld end caps onto the front and rear of the spring perches to give them a cleaner look. Probably another one of those details that'll likely go unnoticed by everybody but me. As cool as the front suspension is, though, it's not quite as cool as what's hanging around out back. Keeping the rear axle in place is a pair of lower control arms that have been mounted outboard similar to an original Type 35, with heim joints at both ends and the arms triangulated slightly towards the forward mounts. Inside, the suspension features quarter elliptical leaf springs splayed from the chassis outwards where they attach to the axle similar to an original car. The springs are fixed at the rear cross member with a pivoting spring eye arrangement and sliding perches on the axle itself. The purpose for the sliding spring mounts, rather than bolting the spring solidly to the axle like an original car, which used the leaf springs for both suspension and axle location, was that the original Type 35s had a torque arm to control spring ramp. Since this car doesn't have a torque arm, I chose not to use the leaves as suspension locating members. And since the springs rest freely on their perches, the axle is able to articulate without binding against the leaves. The perches are welded to a pair of clamps at the same angle the springs are splayed out at, and the clamps bolt the whole assembly to the axle tube. I prefer to make parts bolt on when possible. Should something happen in the future, it's a couple nuts, a couple bolts, and done, rather than re-engineering and re-welding on an axle housing. The perches themselves feature a pair of tabs to ensure the springs maintain their position, with the taller outer tab pulling double duty as the lower shock mount. The eye end of the main leaves were cut off and the end's radius to match the remaining leaves. The packs then rest on anti-friction pads for that quiet sliding action. And since this car doesn't have a torque arm, I chose to locate the axle using the upper control arm bracket as a mount for triangulating a pair of adjustable control arms. They attach to the chassis with a pair of 3/4 inch weight jack bolts that pass through both cross-member plates and down into the spring perch to adjust the ride height, and are mounted with jam nuts on the jack bolts to raise and lower the aft end of the arms, which allows for anti-dive and anti-squat to be tailored to the car's wheelbase and center of gravity. The arms also feature high misalignment joints so they won't bind up as suspension articulates. And if you look really close, just on top of the leaf springs, you can see where I cut one of the leaves I removed from the pack down into a zero rate spacer to give as much ride height adjustment as possible. The whole rear suspension just looks awesome. I think the extra time spent in both the rear and front ends was totally worth it. They're simple enough in operation, yet have enough complexity to really enjoy looking at them. Well, I enjoy looking at them. Actually, the more complete the car gets, the more I really do enjoy looking at it. It's like a piece of artwork coming to life. But can you blame me? It's getting really close to looking like a real car, isn't it?